early 2007, 15 years ago, a video was uploaded to YouTube. It was showcasing a preset on an electronic drum. The preset was called Filter Synth, the drum was called the Mandala Drum, and it was created by a company called Synesthesia Corp. Synesthesia Corp, as far as I can understand, was a small boutique place with a close collaboration with Danny Carey, the drummer from the band Tool. I instantly fell in love with the sounds of this thing. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. It sounded amazing. I had never seen anything like it. And obviously I was thinking to myself, I have to have this, amazing piece of gear. I signed up for the newsletter. I looked around. I looked at eBay. I tried to buy it anywhere, but all sold out. And I'm assuming that they just made a tiny run and I couldn't get a hold of it anywhere. And so the dream was lost for a while. But then I started thinking about it. What made this video so special? What was it that inspired me so much? And I realized recently that I have, I believe, all the elements of actually creating it from scratch. So that's what this video is all about. I'll be using my Synth Deluge. I'll be using the electronic drum set I have, the Roland TD17KL, I think, but I'll just use a single drum from it because it's more about illustrating the idea than using all the bells and whistles. Before we get into it, I just want to briefly cover some of the theory that leads into this so we can understand why things are created the way they are created. So I'll do a little bit of drawing before we kick things off with the actual instruments. So for the setup, we will have my Deluge. It looks something like this. Close enough, the little screen. It will be connected by a MIDI cable into the actual sound module of my electronic drum set. And that in turn looks something like, I don't know, that. And I'll just connect that to a single drum. And the way I'm setting it up like this is because I want the velocity sensitive pad to feed in the signal into the brain and for that to be converted into a MIDI signal that I can then use as part of my Deluge. So that's the setup, very basic, and we'll cover it in more detail as we move along. In order to create the specific sound we're after, we need to create an oscillating synth sound. And for those of you who know what an oscillator is, it's essentially just a sound source that creates oscillations. So a very traditional classic one you may have seen is the sawtooth one, because it sort of looks like a sawtooth, but there's also a square wave, there's also things like a sine wave, and triangle, or variations of all of these. And these are sort of the foundation that a lot of synths take advantage of. There are obviously many more varieties of these, but those are very common ones. In order to create the sound we're after, we're going to go with a sawtooth wave, but we could use any one of these or any other variety of an oscillator to create the sound we're after. And from the oscillator, we're going to think about how we filter the sound. If you've ever seen a spectrum analyzer, you know that it sort of breaks down the sound into typically little bars or a little graph of some variety, covering anything from like bass sounds. Let's say it doesn't have a lot of the upper bass sounds, but then it's got a little bit of the mids there, and then we have some treble as part of the sound. So this will change all the time, and you can see sort of there's more bass, there's a little bit of the mid there, and there's some treble. When we filter a sound, we essentially filter some of these out. So with a high pass filter, you would filter out anything that's lower and let anything that's higher be passed on. So with a high pass, it would sort of look like a curve like this, and then these are all nixed out. And similarly, if you use a low pass filter, you would filter out the higher frequencies and let all the lower ones pass through, but nix out the higher ones. And then there are band pass filters and all sorts of stuff. And so a filter typically runs across all these frequencies and has a shape that sort of looks like that, where anything higher than that is filtered out, anything lower than that is left as is. There's also typically something called resonance as part of a filter, and the filter sort of has a little slope like this, and the resonance can amplify signals right before the slope. So this would be, like the frequencies here in this span would be made louder before it's been attenuated by the actual filter cutoff. That's how you typically create a subtractive synthesis. You have the oscillator, you have the filter, and you have a little bit of resonance. All these are things that we can tie into how loud the drum is being hit. So a softer one can modulate it less, and a louder, more energetic strike can affect it more. For synthesis, I mean, it's not intended to sound realistic, but once we turn it into something that is more about conveying, you know, how we strike the instrument and how the different dynamics and the louder and the softer strikes are affecting the sound, we get a couple of additional considerations. If we think of a loud waveform, so I'm going to assume that you know what a waveform is. It's essentially what you see when you sample some sort of audio signal. You see it if you send a message on most digital messaging services, right? You get a little blob and it sort of looks like that, and you can see the amplitude over time. So it's different from the frequencies that we looked at before. Now it's all about like how loud is it over time. So if volume amplitude is that graph and time is this one, we sort of understand that we're saying something here, then we're quiet for a little bit, then we're saying something more, and then we're quiet for a little bit, and then we're saying something again. Depending on how loud, how hard we strike a drum, this waveform will change. So obviously a louder one will have a bigger waveform, and a softer one will have a quieter one. But this has a couple of implications too for how we choose to modulate the synth when we create it for the drum. If we think of a very loud strike as a simplified sort of abstract way being quiet, and then it's very loud, and then it sort of dies off pretty quickly, and then there's a little bit of sound after. That's the loud one. That's sort of what we see here. For the softer one, it's not as immediate in its attack, and then it sort of dies down because the relative difference between the loud and the quiet is less, so there's more of a slope there. If we were to fit these into the sounds that we're after, yes, there would be a difference in height between these two, but if we imagine a little bit of compression between them, we can create another cool effect, where if we try to fit either of these sounds into this same amplitude, if we want to normalize them so that the loudest point goes down to here, and the loudest point in this one goes all the way up to here, that has implications too. That means that for the first one, the loud strike, it will go in here. It will look sort of like this, and then a quick drop off. Whereas the softer one will look more like that. I hope that makes sense. It's when we attenuate the signal for the louder ones and amplify the signal for the softer ones. We can create a synth using the Deluge that covers a lot of this. Other things that I would at least consider is when we amplify the softer signal, we introduce noise into it, because there's less of a difference between the loudest and the softest part, and when we increase it, we introduce more noise into it. It's the same sort of thing going on with the oscillator, but all of a sudden it's got a little like this kind of thing going on. But that doesn't happen for the louder strike, because we are not introducing anything into that. We're actually diminuting the signal, so the actual tone becomes more clear. So we want noise introduced as part of the softer hits, just a little bit. We also want to consider things like what is the decay and like the fall off for how, and the attack and the decay and the sustain, like all those things. We need to consider how they are different between a softer and a louder hit. That covers most of what I wanted to think about. One last point is maybe we want some of this to be a little bit more random, because it's very hard when you're hitting it like a physical drum to completely capture the same sound twice over. There's always some little variation, or maybe there's a small gust of wind that happened right there, or some sort of reverberation in the room that you're in. So randomization, I think, can help us with creating something that sounds a little bit more natural, a little bit more like a physical modeling synth, as opposed to just the subtractive sawtooth oscillation. So this is where we'll start. Now let's move over to the actual instruments and see how we can take it from there. Okay, here's the setup that we have. We have the Deluge, we have the actual audio module brain from my Roland electronic drum set. We have a single drum pad that's connected to here, and we also have the MIDI signal from here connected back into the Deluge. I'm going to move this off screen because we don't need it for right now, but I'm going to turn it on. And the drum set is resting on a practice pad that I've had since I was 19, so for quite a while now. That's just to not make any major dents into my desk. And if we turn this on, we will end up in the default synth. We want to change this, essentially everything about this. So if we press Shift and Synth, we will create a new synth. Sounds like this. And we can change Shift, type, and go from a square wave, which is the default, into the saw. So now we have a basic saw sound. How do we modulate this? Well, for starters, we need to make sure that our drum pad is connected into the Deluge. So it doesn't do this by default. Like if I hit this, nothing happens. But if I press Learn Input, hold this down, you see the blinking, and then when I hit this, you see how it changes into a different color. That means it is now connected, which is amazing. This is a great first step, but we'll need more before this starts to sound and feel musical. One of the first things that we can do is to press Shift and Frequency, and this will affect the low pass filter. So if I go like this, you see how it goes from the more muffled kind of lower tones into the more open, sharper that we have here. We want this to be modulated by the velocity of how hard we strike the drum. So if I press Shift while this is still blinking, and press velocity down here, and I can turn this up. You hear that with my soft hits here, it doesn't affect it. It sounds more muffled. Whereas if I hit it a bit harder, you know what? I'll probably need a nice drumstick to hit this with. You hear that it's a lot clearer, more open. I think we can actually dial this all the way up to 50. Now we are ready. We need to press back. There we go. And back again. Now we already have something that sounds kind of organic, but we can take this concept a lot further. One thing that we can do is to press Shift and envelope 1 release down here. Tie that to the velocity 2, and then, like we mentioned before, we want the softer hits to have a longer sort of ring, a longer release, slower decay. See, now it does what we want it to do, but in reverse. We want the loudest ones to have the shorter decay, based on what we discussed before. So if I take this down to maybe minus 25, then the softer hits should have a longer release. And the harder hits should have a shorter one. Let's dial it up a little bit more, 40 maybe? Yeah. And then we additionally mentioned that we want to introduce a little bit of noise. Shift, noise to velocity. Turn this up a little. Can we hear anything? I don't think so. Let's see if we can introduce like a little bit of a bass level of noise to begin with. Okay, and then let's add the velocity here. Something like that. You hear the softer hits, noisier, the louder ones, less noise. Maybe 50 is exaggerating, but let's say 40 at least. I don't think this is a very important one, but just for a little bit of authenticity and realism, let's add that. We also mentioned that we want a little bit of randomization in terms of the sound. So if we press Shift, Frequency, while this is blinking, random, and then just turn it up to, I don't know, 5 or 7. I think we should tune this down a little too. Shift, Transpose, turn it down. Yeah, minus an octave, sounds good. And then we can introduce a second oscillator and just do the same thing. Start by changing the type to another saw wave. but again, you can use any which one of the different oscillator types. The level, turn that up a little. And we can change the envelope of the second one so that the harder strikes will have a slightly different envelope than the softer ones. Just to mix things up and create a bit more of an interesting timbre. So envelope 2, let's see what happens if we just extend the release for that one. And it might be clearer if we start to mess with the transpose of the second oscillator too. And the level. I kind of wanted to do the thing in reverse. Let's see if we can change that. Oh, it only goes down. Okay. But we can affect the release of envelope 2 with the velocity. I'm not sure if I can hear anything there, but let's keep it in, because why not? A big part of this exercise is just playing with a different random things to modulate together with the velocity of the strikes, and that to me creates something that feels a lot more organic and interesting. For transpose, for instance, I'm thinking if we hit a drum head, kind of like this one, if we hit it really hard, that will tighten the drum head, which in my brain should reasonably lead to a higher pitch, because if you tighten it, then typically that means that the pitch goes up, right? So I'm sure we can tie the transpose to the velocity. While this is blinking, press velocity, turn it up a little. Obviously that's exaggerated, but just like a little bit. Could be interesting. And then let's detune the two synths a little from each other. So over here. Makes it sound a little bit fatter. We know that the low pass filter sort of opens up depending on how hard we strike it, but we can actually introduce more low pass filter to make the overall sound more muffled to begin with. It will still open up. We can also add a little bit of reverb, and the reverb already is connected to the velocity, because if you only have a little bit of volume, then it won't reverberate much, but if you have a higher volume, then obviously you get more reverberations. We can adjust the reverb by pressing, let me think, where is it? There, dampening. Turn that all the way down. Get these longer kind of trails. And I also think it's interesting to introduce a little bit of delay. And we are already pretty close to what we're after. We can change the envelopes a little bit again, maybe have a shorter decay and sustain on the second oscillator to make it feel a little bit more, here we go, like that's a sound that's more at the softer hits and just up front, while the other one takes more space. So like there are several different timbres that are coming together. I think the delay is a little bit excessive. We can also do something like introduce shift and mod FX type here. And we'll turn on some chorus, maybe. See what that feels like. That should be this one, right? It's just an audio effect, but a pretty cool one. Okay, I think that sort of does it. I'm gonna play with the tuning a little to see how we can get it to a nicer, maybe more bassy frequency. That's cool for the first one. Add a little bit more reverb. And shift room size for the reverb, make that bigger. Nice. Okay, the trails are a little bit too long. Let's dial that down. Okay, I think this effectively creates what we're after. I'm just gonna play a little, like simple rudiments. I'm sitting down, obviously this is not the right angle to do this, but it will give you a sense of what we tried to do. Please let me know if this is something that you are experimenting with yourself, if you come up with any other cool parameters to connect to the velocity of your strikes or anything else. And I know I'm nearing 1,000 subscribers, which feels surreal. Thank you so much for being with me as I experiment with my Deluge and the other instruments I have lying around. Looking forward to the next one, and please let me know if there's anything you like or want to see more of or dislike in the comments. I know this one was a little bit more theoretical, but I wanted to share my thinking instead of just like turning the knobs, because I want to get to the justification, the rationale for why I make the decisions that I make, because those are all parameters that you can experiment with, play with, have a lot of fun with. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one. Thank you.